The early 1900s were a time of anger and discontent. Half of America's population was undergoing severe mistreatment, while the other half was prospering in other countries' wealth. For many years, African Americans were mistreated yet did nothing, for they were forbidden from starting change. But in the 1950s, they started to stand up for what was right. The civil rights movement was approaching, and no one could prepare for the horrors, violence, and outcry that shook our country.
After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, African Americans were freed from slavery, along with slaves from other races as well. The southern states were infuriated by this turn of events, especially after they lost the Civil War. Most of the whites viewed these freed slaves as wild animals let loose to mistreat and avoid them. This feeling caused the southern states to issue the Jim Crow laws that kept whites and African Americans separate but equal. These laws did everything like keep separate bathrooms, hospitals, schools, jobs, restaurants, to things such as circuses, theaters, and libraries. The name Jim Crow derived from a character in a popular minstrel song who was also a character played in a comedy skit in which a white man covered himself in coal dust and acted stupid to imply that African Americans were of lower intelligence. African Americans were displeased of these actions, but many whites took it upon themselves to enforce these laws and keep their town safe. When African Americans fought back against these unfair laws, they would be put in jail for breaking laws. This created a simple trap in which if you tried to gain equality, you would be thrown in jail and would be shamed for being a criminal. In other words, try to be free and you are punished. This was the way it was back then. These are believed to have one of the biggest mistakes America has ever made due to these laws racially segregating the entire country. But in the 1950s, African Americans started to stand up to these laws more and more often with increasing success. Multiple Jim Crow laws were being stopped, and this caused an uproar from the racists in the communities. This caused an upset in society when white racists continuously fought over the change of rights and treated the African Americans worse than ever before.
The 1960s were a very horrific time for African Americans. White racists would harass, beat, lynch, hang, burn, and murder blacks just because of the color of their skin pigment. After the abolishment of slaves, the African Americans were let to do whatever they wanted, but the whites wanted to be separated from them. They did not like the blacks just for being different. They thought they were more superior and treated blacks as second-class citizens. Besides all the beatings and killings, the black people also endured being treated without respect. They'd be shunned and ignored and couldn't participate in the same things whites could. The blacks were like aliens to the whites, being strange and different. The treatment toward the blacks were horrendous, but there were people who believed in equal rights. These people spoke and fought against racial segregation throughout the South. The great and memorable leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, was one of these activists. This valuable leader had helped change the way blacks were treated in the South. King was most famous for his I Have a Dream speech, the March on Selma, and many other monumental events. Now, while King was a peaceful leader, there were other activists who believed in using more violent methods. Some of these leaders were Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party group. They would fight against racist whites and brutal policemen. Blacks were treated in such poor and unfair ways, but unfortunately, this is what most Southern people were used to. Until the 1950s and 60s, change was something no one was expecting. The 1950s and 60s were a time for African American mistreatment to change for the better.
African American men and women have always been thought of as second-class citizens, especially in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. They were detested or hated by some and looked down on by others. African Americans had hard times in the 1960s with finding well-paying jobs or jobs at all. People considered African Americans to be incapable of doing highly advanced jobs that required skill just because of their skin color. Since African Americans were poorer than whites, they could not always afford to go to college. This lack of education left room for even fewer job categories. Most women would become household workers and most men would become operatives. The table shows the distribution of non-whites 35 to 44 years old between the 1960s and 1970s jobs. These categories also include professional and technical workers, managers, officials, and profiteers, except farm. Also clerical workers, sales workers, craftsmen, operatives, harborers, except farm and mine, farmers and farm managers, farm laborers and foremen, service workers, private household, and private household workers. The table includes both female and male non-whites in all of these categories, and even after all the work they did, 30% of African American men and women were unemployed. Having such low-paying jobs or no jobs at all, African Americans were forced into even further separation from whites. This caused people to speak out against the separation despite the consequences.
African Americans had to fight endlessly to gain the rights they deserved. Although racists were extreme and brutal, African Americans managed to protest peacefully day after day. They always had a clear goal and weren't giving up until they achieved it. On December 1st, 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks was arrested. The NAACP contributor had not given up her front seat to a white passenger. Although Parks was off to jail in December 1955, the NAACP thought it was the perfect opportunity to challenge segregation laws in the major southern city of Montgomery. The group then called out all of Montgomery's African Americans, political and religious leaders to help advocate a boycott, protesting Parks' arrest. On the day of the boycott, only 8 African Americans rode the buses of Montgomery. After the one-day boycott, a long-term boycott was organized by political and religious leader Dr. Martin Luther King. King had organized that until all segregation on buses ended, African Americans wouldn't ride Montgomery's buses. After about 381 days, and blacks having to carpool and walk to get to their destination, the Supreme Court ruled segregation on Montgomery's buses unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott was just one of the many protests African Americans had held. Sitting at counters for hours at a time was also a way blacks were able to gain the right to sit there. These protests were called sit-ins. It all started with 4 African American college freshmen, Ezell Blair, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, politely asked for service at a lunch counter and were ignored until closing on February 1st, 1960. The next day, they brought in more students. Very soon, more than 50,000 Southern students had joined in. The young protesters endured taunt, arrests, and beatings, but still sat patiently waiting for their service. Soon enough, businesses started to integrate. To keep with change, black students across the United States of America formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in October 1960. Operating in the South, the committee organized demonstrations, teaching in freedom schools, and registering voters. After about a year of the big sit-ins, people started to notice that although Montgomery's buses were supposed to be integrated, they weren't, as well as many other buses across the South. As a result, in May 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality came up with the idea for black and white bus riders to ride buses that led through segregated areas. They called themselves the Freedom Riders. As the riders progressed, white supremacists surrounded a bus, set it on fire, and attacked the riders as they left in Alabama on May 14, 1961. Across the state, the riders were beaten and jailed. Although the Freedom Riders never reached their final destination of New Orleans, they were able to achieve colored and white sections coming down in more than 300 southern cities. As the buses went through their journey, President Kennedy sent federal agents to protect them and attempted to get them to stop, but they wouldn't. They were persistent and strong. The Montgomery boycott, sit-ins, and journey of the Freedom Riders were just some of the major African American protests. Others include the March on Washington, the Selma March, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, the Birmingham Campaign, and many more. By being determined and hardworking, African Americans got the changes they wanted.
You learned about how African Americans were treated, but who did it most? The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan were the ones who did the worst things to African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, was the first American terrorist group. They were founded in 1866 by college students in Pulaski, Tennessee. There were about 5,000 to 8,000 members, but there were up to 40,000 members during this time period. The Ku Klux Klan was a very organized group. If you ask anyone who knows one thing about them, they will probably talk about what they wore. They wore white robes with white pointy hats. These hats had eye holes. Most people don't know is that there are different positions. These positions are the Nighthawk, Cyclops, Grand Dragon, and Imperial Wizard. Some of the higher positions, like Imperial Wizard, have different colored robes, like purple. The Klansmen are all Christian, but they believed in white power. There are even kids less than 7 years old in the KKK. They ruined many African Americans' lives. Most citizens at this time would call the African Americans names. The Ku Klux Klan did even worse. They used arsenal, rape, bombs, and even murder. This time period was a very huge period for the KKK. Their way of intimidation to the African Americans were cross burnings. They would even pull African Americans from their house and whip them. An example of what the Ku Klux Klan does is in 2008, the leader of the KKK said that they would assassinate Barack Obama if he got elected. They also joined the German American Bund. This is where the German army would fund them or give them money. It didn't work out because Hitler and his army lost to the Jews and the Americans. Martin Luther King was terrorized by the KKK a lot. He's had multiple bombs thrown on his porch and many people trying to assassinate him. Plenty of times, a car full of Klansmen drove by him and threatened or even just stared. Martin Luther King was eventually assassinated. The KKK also killed Medgar Evers. He was a field secretary for the NAACP, an organization put together to try and stop the Jim Crow laws. The field secretary was a high up position. The KKK did bad things.
Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the views on segregation continuously separated America into two different sides. As time progressed, America realized how unfair things really were. By all people working together, no matter what color they were, they all found a way to make sure everyone was treated equally. When Americans worked for a difference and saw the impact it had made, more and more of them continued to join in on the fight. Till this day, the fight for equality still continues and society pushes for a better tomorrow. How will you help make sure of someone else's better tomorrow?